Welcome back into the Pick and Roll NBA podcast with Jet and Sap. We are presented by Full Press Coverage. Sap, you and I have been pretty good about predicting games. I think this playoffs. Certainly not amazing, but over 50%, which I am proud of personally. Series, I have not been good at picking. Games, pretty good at. We did not have last night, correct? At all. The
Well, no,
Clippers.
I did have the point spread correct.
Oh yeah, the
I thought
spread.
the Suns
Okay,
would win, but it would be a
we
point
both did the
basket.
Suns. You did
For
have the spread.
gamblers, but for gamblers, they couldn't care less who wins the game as long as they win the game. So
You're
I
right.
thought it would be a close game because I still don't trust Phoenix 100%, and I also respect the hell out of the Clippers because they've got some junkyard dogs on that team, led by their head coach, who's done a phenomenal job. They're like, the bad pair of underwear that you can't seem to get rid of, or the bad penny you can't get rid of, or the cockroach you can't get out of your apartment. They're tough.
Yeah, no, you're right. You did nail the spread. I have to give you credit for that, absolutely. And Ty Lue's record in elimination games is phenomenal, as is his record in closeout games. They're both outstanding, and he's proving to be just a tremendous head coach. And so he gets a lot of credit last night as the Clippers survive to force a game 6 in this series. They win 116-102. But as much credit as Ty Lue gets, and he deserves a lot, the most of the credit goes to Paul George, who was phenomenal last night.
That's his greatest playoff performance by far. 41 points, 13 rebounds, 6 assists, and he did it so efficiently, Jed. He was 15 of 20 from the floor, 3 of 6 from 3, hit all 8 of his free throws, played his customary really good defense, had 20 points in the pivotal third quarter. Every time you felt Phoenix coming back, he would make a big play. It was his signature game. Now, can he put another game like that back-to-back? We'll find out tomorrow night when, again, the Clippers are still facing elimination. And as far as home court advantage, there's some there, but obviously Phoenix was able to get a split in L.A., and we've seen that in 3 games in Phoenix, the Clippers have been right there. I mean, as we said yesterday, very easily the Clippers could have this series wrapped up. I think they've been the better team from games 1 through 5. It's just that in particular pockets of games, Phoenix has been just good enough to win those games. But if you look in totality, I think that the Clippers have been the better team, but they trailed 3 games to 2. But Paul George was sensational last night. And again, now we get the overreaction of, oh, no, he's definitely a number 1. He's a great playoff performer. No, that's not necessarily the case. He had a great game last night. We'll see if he can do it again in game 6.
Yeah, and I'm glad, like I said yesterday, this series deserves to go further than 5 because it has been so tight. And so now we have game 6. We could potentially have a game 7. And these teams do seem relatively evenly matched. We were texting during the game last night, and you said it had Kawhi been on the court, this would be the Clippers in a breeze. And that very well may be true. But without Kawhi, they're a lot more evenly matched, certainly. And Paul George this was his version of that Kevin Durant game 5 against Milwaukee in the last round, where he just put the entire team on his back. Yeah, he was phenomenal. And credit to the role players in the Clippers, who in the games where they've won, the role players have stepped up. Morris was very good last night. Reggie Jackson, very good last night. And DeMarcus Cousins, who I thought was basically just a walking corpse, he was massive for them last night. 15 points off the bench and played really hard and physical in the post. Had a couple of really nice plays down the stretch, putbacks around the rim. And so those role players stepped up for the Clippers and did just enough to sort of complement the fantastic play of Paul George to win this game on the road.
Marcus Morris is the X factor on this team. When he shoots 50% or better from the floor so far in the postseason, they're 8-0. That's pretty impressive. It always harkens back to the Celtics roster 2 years ago when he was probably the 7th or 8th best player on that roster. Now he's probably the 3rd best player on the Clippers roster with Kawhi out. You'd say Paul George is still by far their best player. After that, maybe Reggie Jackson is their 2nd best player. Marcus Morris is their 3rd best player. Your guy, Pat Beverly, is out there doing what he does, which is irritate everyone. And the makeup of this Clippers team is strange because they went out and they signed Kawhi Leonard 2 years ago as a free agent. Then they got the trade done with Oklahoma City to get Paul George. But the rest of that roster is made up of mostly cast-offs, right? I mean, Marcus Morris has played for a ton of teams. Reggie Jackson Washington was bought out by the Detroit Pistons. Pat Beverly, I think, has played on every team in the NBA. He's not a classic NBA player. He's just a nuisance, a guy that in big games tries to get in the head of the opponents. Even Zubac, who didn't play last night, was just basically given away by the Lakers. Rondo has been on several teams towards the end of his career. So it's kind of a ragtag team. It almost feels like the old Oakland Raiders. That's what they used to do, bring in all the guys that were in their early 30s that were pretty much done, and they'd have one last gasp with the Oakland Raiders, and they won a couple of Super Bowls that way. Paul George was great. Ty Lue also, the way he is so calm on the sideline, even in game situations, but going from game to game, how calm he is and in control he is. And last night he comes out and plays the zone. I think it confused Phoenix somewhat. And Phoenix wasn't able to take advantage of not having Zubac in the lineup for the Clippers. They didn't go to DeAndre Ayton enough. I think they should have gone more to him.
That's a great point, Sap. I was just about to say that without Zubac out, and that was right before the game that he was ruled out. You thought, okay, well, this is the last stand for the Clippers. They don't really have a shot because of how well Ayton's been playing. And Ayton just finished with 10 points, only 9 field goal attempts. Chris Paul, 19 field goal attempts. Devin Booker, 22 field goal attempts. So you want Ayton to have more than that. He should be at least in double digits. I know 9 is close to 10, but I'm talking about 15 plus for DeAndre
Absolutely.
Ayton. Especially considering how efficient he is, and he's actually historically efficient this postseason. He's been putting the ball in the rim at a field goal percentage that is among the best of all time for a given playoffs. They didn't use him nearly enough with that massive matchup advantage that you just mentioned, Sap, and this was statistically his worst game of the series. And it's not like he played poorly. The usage percentage was really low for him.
Get him the ball. Again, the Clippers packed in and dared the Suns to beat you from the outside. And other than Devin Booker, their perimeter guys had problems out there. Although Cam Johnson, who's a very nice player, when he comes off the bench, he gives you 20 minutes of efficient play. In fact, he played much better than either Jay Crowder or Mikal Bridges last night. So I think you may see more of Cam Johnson in Game 6 when it moves to the Staples Center. The other thing, too, is you look at Chris Paul and Devin Booker. The last 3 games since Chris Paul's been back combined, they're 41 of 125. That's 33% from the floor. Those are 2 all-star players. I mean, Chris Paul was top 5 MVP. We know how good Devin Booker is. Yes, he's playing with that broken nose. I think it has had some impact on him. But to shoot 41 of 125 over a 3-game stretch, that's horrific. And it's going to fall on those guards to be better in Game 6, because I think Ty Lue is going to cook up something on defense and say, well, you guys aren't shooting well. We're going to dare you to try to beat us.
Yeah, and I think that Monty Williams got a little bit desperate last night too, because some of those things weren't working, especially efficiency-wise. So he went deep into his bench last night. He played 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 guys off of his bench last night, which is very atypical in a playoff game, especially one that's not a blowout, which last night was not. I mean, the final score indicated it was more of a blowout, but it really wasn't. And you saw guys like Torrey Craig get in there. Sarge played 11 minutes. Nader, who former Celtic, by the way, Abdel Nader, he got in there. So I think Monty Williams was just trying to find things that would work, any sort of combination that could give them a lift. And unfortunately, other than, as you mentioned, Cam Johnson, they didn't. Nobody off their bench was able to really help them all that much. So we'll see how they adapt to the zone. If that's indeed what the Clippers stick with going forward. I don't know what Zubac's status is going to be for the next game. But clearly Ty Lue made a terrific adjustment saying, well, we're not going to be able to match up one-on-one with Ayton because we don't have our big in there. So we're going to try this zone. And it really worked out tremendously for them. I will say that in terms of Monty Williams, who I agree is a fantastic coach, there was the play that they drew up, I think it was right before the half, was just awesome. They basically ran a hook and ladder.
Yeah,
an NFL play to get a wide open 3. And I know they lost the game, but I don't think I've ever seen that in an NBA game. And it was just an awesome play where it was an inbounds pass from the baseline, the opposite baseline, to, I think, Ayton at center court, who basically just hooked and lateraled it to Devin Booker, who got a wide open 3. It was a great play. I mean, if I'm any coach in the NBA, I'm stealing that immediately. It was a really awesome play. I know they lost, but it was a really good play.
It was a great play. Yeah, I saw you tweet about that, and I agree 100%. And the thing is, too, with Booker, he didn't rush it. He got the handoff from DeAndre Ayton, got just behind the 3-point line. Instead of trying to rush it, he kind of pump faked. The defender went by him, and he drained the 3-pointer. It cut it from 10-7. At that point, I'm like, okay, Phoenix has a little momentum here. They're going to be able to come back and win this game. And they did take a 1-point lead in the third quarter, but then Paul George went off. I mean, Paul George's third quarter is his masterpiece of his career. Yep. And this is an outstanding player without question. The more I watch Paul George, in some ways it's frustrating because there aren't many guys in the league, Jet, that have the total package like Paul George has. He doesn't have a discernible weakness, right? I mean, he can shoot from 3 levels, right? He's a good 3-point shooter, mid-range. He can finish it. His brain is his weakness. It's not as though he's not a smart player. It's just lack of confidence at times. I mean, if he had Reggie Jackson or Pat Beverly's like confidence, he'd be damn scary. Or even like Jimmy Butler. I think Paul George has a better skill set than Jimmy Butler because Jimmy Butler really can't shoot. They're both excellent defenders.
I was going to say, is he better as a complementary player or as a second guy, or is he better as an alpha?
He's a number 2 guy. That's why today on a lot of talk radio and on the national shows, well, he's now a number 1. No, he's not. Again, we even debated this yesterday. Is Giannis really a 1? Because that's a whole different thing. There aren't a lot of 1s in the NBA. He reminds me, actually, his game is a lot like Scottie Pippen's. Scottie Pippen was perfect in that role, and I know we're going to talk about Scottie a little bit later in the podcast because he may be going off the rails a little bit, and I do like his new hairdo. I think it's pretty cool as he's pushing his new bourbon brand and his book that's coming out in the fall. But he reminds me a lot of Scottie Pippen. Great defender, right? I mean, Paul George can play defense. Excellent passer, rebounder. Can score from all different levels. But Pippen was best suited to be a number 2, and I think Paul George is best suited to be a number 2. I don't know if Kawhi's really the alpha either, because he's not really a leader. He's not communicative. The real leader on that team, for all intents and purposes, could be Marcus Morris or Reggie Jackson or Patrick Beverly. I mean, you got to be a little bit better of a player than Pat Beverly to be the leader of the team. But you get my point. Those other 2 players who are so immensely skilled in Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, they're really not leaders, but they can go out and still put up great numbers. He reminds me, the more I watched last night, I said, this looks a lot like Scottie Pippen, except he forced it a little bit more last night because he had to, and he got the job done.
Yeah, the reason I asked the question, Sap, isn't so much like, well, obviously, I think the team would have more success, any team he's on, if he's the number 2. But does his game, when he has to have that burden of being the guy, and it can't be passive, and knows he has to kind of unlock his full potential because he's the only option on that team, is that more of a role conducive to individual success for Paul George to be sort of forced into the role of having to be the guy?
I think he can do it in bits and pieces, right? Like he did it last night, but maybe not the night before, right? Like he had a disastrous game 4. He missed the 2 big free throws at the end of game 2, which could have essentially iced that game.
Right.
So, kind of comes and goes. And look, Michael Jordan didn't make every big shot he ever took. LeBron James hasn't hit every big shot he took, but they were willing to take it. Paul George at times has kind of run away from that moment. I think he's perfectly suited as a number 2 guy. And as I said, as we look at these 4 teams that are remaining, they don't have a classic dog. They don't have a classic alpha. Yes, Giannis puts up the numbers, but his game is somewhat limited. Trae Young he's too small to be the guy. I mean, you're not generally going to have a 6-foot point guard lead you to a championship. I mean, the last one that really did it was Isaiah Thomas, but he had a great cast around him. Steph Curry a little bit bigger, and he had a great cast around him. So, these 4 teams that are left, one of them is going to win the championship somehow, by default maybe, but I wouldn't put Paul George in that class. But as a talent, my Lord, he does everything out there. That's why when I always compare Jason Tatum to him, people would push back and go, no, Tatum's got to be better than that. I'm going, well, yeah, maybe he has to be better than that, but does Jason Tatum really have a better skill set than Paul George? I mean, Paul George is a better defender, a better passer. I think Tatum might be a slightly better rebounder, or they're about the same. And I think Tatum infinitely is a better shooter than Paul George, but not by much. I mean, this guy heats up. He can stretch it out quite a bit. So I think he's a player who is less than the sum of his parts, the opposite of Jimmy Butler, who's a player who's more than the sum of his parts. That's why if you could have taken Butler's DNA and heart and balls and attitude and stuck it into Paul George, you'd have LeBron James. You'd have that level of player, but it doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have LeBron. I don't want to put too much pressure on these guys. LeBron's a completely different animal than everyone else. But you get my point. You'd have Kevin Durant.
No, I get what you're saying. I mean, he is. I agree with you that he is at times maddening because you see so much talent, and he is wildly inconsistent, especially in the postseason, where it's so unusual to see a player of his caliber have games that are just complete no-shows. I mean, that is rare. People have off games, but not games like he's had before, where he's had 2 of 20 shooting from the floor.
He had a 5-point game in an elimination game playing alongside Russell Westbrook.
That's weird.
That's not good. You're not going to see LeBron do that. You never saw Jordan do that. Yeah, Durant's not going to do that.
I'm saying you don't see any stars really do that. Like, I'm not saying like the level of LeBron or Jordan or Durant even. I'm like Giannis,
Giannis
despite his flaws, he's not going to put up a 4-point game or a 5-point game. It's not going to happen.
Yeah. Harden's had some stinkers too, but he's such a volume scorer that he's going to somehow get to 17 points by taking 25 shots if need be.
Right.
So you get my point. And also, we've talked a lot about the Clippers and giving them a lot of love here. The Phoenix Suns have to look and say, we've had a pretty comfortable path to this point, right? You played the Lakers in the first round with a hobbled LeBron, and then you had Anthony Davis essentially miss half of the series, so they were able to get through the Lakers. Then you faced Denver without Jamal Murray and a team that was on fumes at that point, because Denver was one of the 4 teams that made it to the conference finals a year ago, and they were the last one to survive this year, and they were
didn't miss a game all year long, so I mean he was tired.
Yeah, so they were gassed, and then you play the Clippers, who don't have their best player in Kawhi Leonard. I know you lost Chris Paul for the first 2 games, but you got by. And the Suns have to look and say, this is a pressure game 6. You don't want to get to game 7 because Chris Paul doesn't have a great history in game 7s. And that may be in the back of his mind. I know after they won game 4, the narrative was, oh, you're up 3-1. He goes, well, being up 3-1 hasn't always worked for me. And maybe that's in the back of his mind. And now Booker and Ayton, these 2 young guys who absolutely adore Chris Paul, I hope they don't put too much pressure on themselves saying, we're doing this for Chris, because then now you can start getting a little misguided and getting out of yourself to try to win a game for a fellow player. That can get dangerous.
No, the Clippers are to their credit, very difficult to put away. I mean, they've proven to be very difficult. They're like the boxer you keep, who has like an unbelievable chin. You keep punching him right in the face and he just won't go down. Yeah. You're saying, man, go down, stay down. They won't do it. So yeah, this is a big game. A lot more, the Clippers, as strange as it sounds, are playing with somewhat house money here because Kawhi is out. And they're in their first conference final. So people are just, happy that they've gotten to this level to a degree. The Suns are the prohibitive favorites, but they need to be able to put them away. And closeout games are not easy in the NBA, especially for teams that have not done it before. And the Suns have not closed out a team like this before in this sort of setting. Even Chris Paul hasn't.
I think there's more pressure on Chris Paul than any player in this postseason. There's a lot of pressure on Giannis to break through and win a championship, but Giannis is also 8 years younger than Chris Paul. And look, this is a great opportunity for all of these teams because Brooklyn had a lot of injuries. The Lakers had injuries. Golden State's going to be better next year when Klay Thompson comes back. So I think the field is going to be tougher next year than it is right now. All 4 of these teams can look, maybe with the exception of the Atlanta Hawks, and say, we've got a real opportunity to win a championship here because the path is opened up for us. Here's Chris Paul at 36 years old. This may be his last best chance to win a championship, and that changes his legacy. Giannis has a lot of pressure as well, but again, he's only 28. More pressure on Chris Paul than anybody else in these playoffs right now, and he's going to have to step up and play better than he has in games 3, 4, and 5.
Yeah, absolutely. He is, and like I said, those closeout games are difficult, Sap, and they, as you mentioned, they were able to get by the Lakers, a very hobbled Lakers team that seemed to have kind of given up after Anthony Davis was out. So I don't think they were playing particularly hard. The Lakers, Denver, they closed them out because they swept them. They had no problem with them. There was no pressure really there towards the end of that series. And this is the first team that's really challenged the Suns in this postseason. After the first couple of games with the Lakers, where those guys went down with Anthony Davis went down with injury, this is the first team that's really pushed back and said, we're not going to make it easy for you. So that presents a different challenge, and we'll see if Phoenix is up for it. But the Clippers are not going to lay down.
No, they're a tough bunch. They are as tough as a $5 steak.
Yep. All right, Sap, let's move on to the game tonight. The Bucks and the Hawks in game 4 of this series. The Bucks are up 2-1. This game is in Atlanta. The spread on it is 6.5 points favoring Milwaukee, so favoring the road team. How do you see it playing out?
I think it's going to be a close game. I know Trae Young is questionable. I guess there's a chance he plays, and if he does, how limited he's going to be. He's a 6-foot point guard who relies on quickness. He has that problem with his right foot, which has got a bruise in the ankle from stepping on the official, and that's a tough injury to deal with. The one thing is that a lot of his game relies on quickness, so he may be limited in that case, but if he's able to break down the defense, when he puts up those teardrop shots, those floaters, he's going to be jumping off his left leg, not his right leg, so he won't be hindered as much if he was a left-handed shooter, which you jump off your right leg. I think somehow Atlanta will keep this close. Again, they're like the Clippers. They look dead against the 76ers, and in 2 games came back to win after falling behind by 18 and 26 in separate games. They came back and won. Now, I think Milwaukee's a little bit better constructed to hold on to those leads than, say, Philadelphia is. But nonetheless, I think they'll keep it close. But at the end, I think Milwaukee will win because, again, it seems like Atlanta now, which was playing on a lot of emotion, a lot of confidence, they seem to be running into a wall somewhat. And they just don't have enough firepower for guys to create their own shots. You know, I mean, they're so reliant on Trae Young, not only scoring 30, but dishing out a dozen assists. Like John Collins and Clint Capella, they're so reliant on Trae Young. If he's not beyond 80%, they're going to be limited, and I think that Milwaukee will win. But I do think Atlanta keeps it close because Milwaukee has a tendency also of doing some mysterious things down the stretch and making the game closer than it should be.
Yeah, I had Milwaukee in 5 in this series, so I'm obviously going to pick the Bucks tonight. And in game 1, that's sometimes how it goes. Is game 1 is that feeling out game, and the underdog team will take that. And with Trae Young less than 100%, and I think he is going to play tonight. That obviously diminishes the Hawks even more. So I think Milwaukee will win pretty comfortably tonight, and then follow up in Milwaukee and close out the series there at 5. So I'll take them with the points. I just think that it's more their time than Atlanta. Atlanta shouldn't really be here right now. They're far ahead of schedule. Milwaukee, this is where they're supposed to be, and they've been preparing for this for years now. So I like Milwaukee in this game. I think Giannis has just been so consistent. And if they can get a good game out of Middleton, the stats show if he plays well, they win. If he doesn't play well, they typically lose. So we'll see what Middleton is the best indicator of if they're going to win the game or not. If he plays well early, most likely Milwaukee will win the game without issue. If he struggles, it would be a more competitive game. But I'll take Milwaukee in this, Sap. In terms of if Atlanta does get eliminated in a couple of days here, I do wonder if Capella and Collins are a little bit too redundant, and if they could maybe use one of them to try to get Trae Young some more scoring help, because they're both good players, obviously, but they do similar things. I know Collins has a little 3-point shot, and Capella can't score outside of the paint, but I do feel like sometimes they're in each other's way because they're both such great athletes, and Trae Young could use more of a traditional second scorer next to him to take some of the pressure off. So maybe they look to make that move, but that's something we can talk about in the offseason a little bit more.
Yeah, because I think John Collins was supposed to be available at the trade deadline. I remember the Celtics were interested in John Collins, but Atlanta didn't make a move.
Yeah, he's a restricted free agent.
They are in the conference finals. Yeah, so I think that makes a lot of sense because you may not need both of those guys. You may need to get a secondary scorer for Trae Young, perimeter shooter, or someone that can create his own shot. They kind of lack that at this point. And again, you got Cam Reddish, who I think is going to be a fine pro, but not an all-star caliber pro, but he's been hurt. You expect to get him back next year and improving as well.
Yeah. All right, Sap. So, that does it for our preview for tonight's game. We don't have to, keep talking about it because we'll see what actually happens. The story that both of us really wanted to talk about is one that sort of shook the NBA world a little bit because Scottie Pippen, who's on some sort of tour to burn down all the fields, like, Sherman's March, a little history reference for you all there. He, for some reason, has decided to say Phil Jackson his former coach with the Bulls and former coach with the Lakers. So he didn't coach Scottie Pippen with the Lakers. Scottie Pippen never played for the Lakers. But Phil Jackson is racist, according to Scottie Pippen. He had an interview with GQ, which we've talked about last week, where he ripped Ben Simmons and Kevin Durant. Pippen also said that in that interview that he felt insulted and disrespected by Phil Jackson. And this came back to sap a very old story that got brought up again during The Last Dance about a play in a playoff game that was designed for Tony Kukoc to take the game-winning shot. Scottie Pippen was so upset that Kukoc was the designated shooter that he wouldn't come off the bench and didn't report into the game after that. And Michael Jordan and the Last Dance documentary really harkened on that in terms of calling out Pippen and his heart and that sort of stuff. And I don't think he took kindly to that. Pippen is now trying to change the narrative of that story and saying, well, the reason it was designed for Tony Kukoc is because Phil Jackson's racist. And then he expounded on that a little bit more. But Sap, what's sort of your initial thought to that?
I think this media tour that Scottie Pippen is on, the interview with GQ, he was on Dan Patrick's show just yesterday. He's got a book coming out in the fall. He's pushing his bourbon brand. I think this is all a pushback to The Last Dance, because The Last Dance was, again, produced by Michael Jordan. It was a 10-part series. At times, it was incredibly entertaining. At other times, it was insufferable. Again, this is coming from a LeBron James fan. And I remember when it came out, there were no sports being played. So this is what we look forward to on a Sunday night, right? We'd see two episodes on a Sunday night. This was about it for sports back in April, May of 2020, whenever it came out. And, of course, the likes of Skip Bayless would come out and say, this is an incredible hit on the legacy of LeBron James because look at Michael Jordan. Okay, so the thing with Scottie Pippen is I think he's really pissed off at this point. First of all, Michael Jordan wasn't even on that Bulls team that Pippen and Kukoc were playing with. There was the 94 season, the first of the 2 years that Jordan was out. I know Jordan came back at the end of his second year, but that was the 93-94 second-round playoff series against the Knicks. And Kukoc did hit that game-winning shot. The Knicks ended up winning that series in 6, but Jordan wasn't on the team at that point. The year before, the Bulls had won the NBA championship going 57-25. The first year without Jordan, they went 55-27. And they went to the second round of the playoffs, and Pippen finished third in MVP voting. So if I'm Pippen, I'm like, okay, Michael, this is your documentary. Why are you shitting on me? You weren't even on that team. Like, what is that really belong in this 10-part series? I guess you put in a documentary, whatever the hell you want, right? I mean, Michael Jordan was the executive of this documentary. So if I'm Pippen, I'm pushed back. And then, there were references to Pippen in Game 7 of the 1990 Eastern Conference Finals when he had the migraine and couldn't really be effective against the Pistons. The Pistons won, ended up repeating as champions. At that point, it was like Jordan's never going to win a championship, and then he won 6 out of the next 8. He also shit on Pippen, saying, well, Pippen was selfish because, he wouldn't deal with a medical injury until the start of the next season. And it's something Shaq O'Neal has done, who said, I'm not rehabbing on my time, I'll rehab on your time. Look, if a player has some sort of injury, I think it makes more sense to take care of it in the off season so you're ready to go for the next season. That's just me saying that. But now Pippen's pushing back that Jordan is selfish, which of course Jordan's selfish. Every great player is selfish. The problem with Scottie Pippen is, Jet, if you're in a feud with Michael Jordan, in the court of public opinion, you're going to lose. Mother Teresa would lose in the court of public opinion to Michael Jordan. He's the most respected, loved athlete I've ever seen. And Michael Jordan he is, like Donald Trump said, he could go out on Fifth Ave and shoot someone and his supporters would not blame him for that. Michael Jordan has the same love from his fans. They see nothing wrong with Michael Jordan. He could assault someone and they'd say, well, that person was just in the way. So Pippen's not going to win this at all.
So is that why he's going at Phil Jackson to sort of be adjacent to Michael Jordan? Because I mean, it's a big claim to say Phil Jackson's a racist. First of all, I want to get this out of the way. I don't think that's true. I don't think you can survive as an NBA coach for as long as Phil Jackson didn't be racist. Point blank. I don't think it's possible. So I'll just throw that out there. With this specific instance, listen, I push back on Phil Jackson being the greatest coach of all time and stuff like that because he did coach great players. So every great coach coaches great players. They go hand in hand. To say that Phil Jackson in a playoff game or any game was willing to put race ahead of winning the game sounds insane to me. And for Pippen to say that, yeah, you know what? Kukoc, the only reason he took that shot is because he was white, I was black. Phil Jackson wanted a white guy to get all the accolades. That is, it seems like at best a far stretch. At worst, I mean, a salacious lie.
Yeah, I mean, when you call someone a racist, that's pretty tough stuff, and it's not easy to prove, and it's something that you can't just throw out there, because what happens is if you use it all of the time, then when it really applies, it loses some of its juice, right? So you can't just go out there and say Phil Jackson was a racist. The man won 11 championships as a coach. His best players were all black, right? Whether it's Jordan, Pippen, Kobe, or Shaq. So I think I don't think Michael Jordan would say that Phil Jackson was racist. If Kobe Bryant was ever asked that question, I'm sure he wouldn't say that, although Kobe did have his problems with Phil Jackson. And then they kind of patched things together, and Phil came back and won 2 more titles with Kobe. Shaq speaks glowingly of Phil Jackson. Shaq and Michael Jordan are the 2 guys that just, have all plaudits for Phil Jackson. Yeah, rightfully so.
Dennis Rodman does too.
Dennis Rodman as well. And like he had to maneuver some huge personalities. Now, when you have that talent, that's great. But how many times do you say Brad Stevens is a great X and O coach, but he can't handle personalities? Well, Phil Jackson, I think he was a good X and O coach, but he was the best maybe ever at dealing with
best ever.
Really difficult personalities, especially that second three-peat Chicago. You had Jordan, you had Pippen. Kukoc was someone who Jordan and Pippen pushed back against. In the 92 Olympics, all they had heard about is how great Kukoc was from Bulls management. They abused him in the Olympic
games.
They tortured him. And then you've got Dennis Rodman into the equation, and, just Jerry Krause hates Phil Jackson, who hates Jerry Krause, and everybody hates Jerry Krause. I mean, that was, talk about drama. That's why The Last Dance
I agree. He's the best manager personalities ever.
He can handle chaos like no one else. In fact, I think he probably feeds off of that. So, no, he's not a racist. I mean, come on, that's tough to prove. But here it is. Scottie Pippen's trying to be relevant. I mean, he's been out of the league 20 years. We all know he's a great player. He wants to be considered greater than what people remember him as, but he's got a book coming out. He's got a bourbon company that he's pushing. So what better way to get people's eyeballs on you, their ears on you, is to say crazy shit, right? If he just went on the Dan Patrick show and just, broke down the playoffs and talked about, Kawhi Leonard and Paul George, their games are similar to mine. I think we're all cut from the same cloth. No one would replay those bites, and we wouldn't be talking about it. He calls Phil Jackson a racist. He said Michael Jordan was selfish, which I think is true. Every great player is selfish. Yeah, this is Scottie Pippen's way of getting people to talk about it. So now maybe people want to read this book that's coming out in the fall, and maybe people want to try the bourbon that he's pushing. Who knows?
Yeah, and another instance he pointed to try to prove his point about Phil Jackson, which again I completely disagree with, is that he said, Phil Jackson wrote that book right before he left, right after he left, the first time for the Lakers, about like the lost season, I think it's called. I've actually read the book. It's a very good book. It's interesting for just to get inside the locker room. And he's saying, he was belittling Kobe Bryant, and that is why he's another example of how he's racist. I mean, I think, it's pretty well documented that Kobe Bryant was a massive pain in the ass at that point in his career.
Oh, sure.
Too. I'm not saying that, Phil Jackson was always an easy person to get along with, because he hasn't been, but I don't think the motive behind the book was that he was racist. It was the same motive that Pippen's having now. It was Phil Jackson was trying to come up with an excuse to make himself look better. That season was a disaster, and he wanted to distance himself from it and said, it was really Kobe's fault. I don't think it was a racial motivation behind it. It was a selfish motivation, certainly, but the same can be said about what Scottie Pippen's doing right now. It's a completely selfish motivation, which is fine. This is sort of how the game works, but calling Phil Jackson racist is unfair. And I mean, it's damaging somebody's reputation that really, you don't need to. Why are you dragging Phil Jackson through the mud right now? He really didn't do anything to you, and nor does anybody deserve to be called racist who isn't racist.
Here's the thing, Jet. We're talking about the NBA, which is 80% black. So, in theory, 80% of the players we criticize are going to be black. Does that make us racist? No. We're just looking from a macro at at certain things or a micro at other things, and we pontificate about it. If we criticize Paul George for not maybe being the mentally toughest player in the league, does that make us racist? No, we're looking at what we see and we're giving you our opinions. So if Phil Jackson had some derogatory things to say about Kobe Bryant, that was one of his two great players with the Lakers, right? Like he's not going to bring up, I don't know, Rick Fox or Smush Parker or someone else that was on those rosters, or Derek Fisher or someone else, like secondary role players. No, it's going to be what's going to sell the book, talking about Shaq and Kobe. That you could write books on Shaq and Kobe's relationship. You certainly could write books. You did a 10-part documentary on the Chicago Bulls, which the more I look at it, I don't even know any team in my lifetime that's remotely as interesting as that. I mean, like the Patriots won 6 Super Bowls with Belichick and Brady, and it got kind of juicy at the end with Brady, Belichick, Brady, but nothing like the Bulls. I mean, that was just total drama, chaos, personalities, infighting, and yet, you know what? They've just plowed through that and won. Maybe the Yankees in the 70s with, Reggie Jackson and Thurman Munson, that was one of the first great teams that I got to see. And they had a lot of that, but they didn't have a run like the Bulls or the Patriots. Normally, these dynasties, like the San Antonio Spurs, would anybody want to see a 10-part documentary on the San Antonio Spurs?
No, it would air on PBS. That's where it would air.
Exactly, yeah. Tim Duncan would just be poolside, relaxing. Popovich would be giving his speeches, and Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili would be, attentively watching. Yeah, it would be the most boring thing you could think of. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf is an all-time great movie because they had Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor in it. It's like you didn't even have to act. Just roll the camera and let those two go at it, and it's going to be great drama. Same thing with the Bulls in the 90s. I mean, that was the team. Even the Golden State Warriors, they won 3 titles in 5 years. They had some interesting things there, right? Draymond's a personality, but nothing like the Bulls. I mean, the Bulls were, even more than that, were worldwide. Michael Jordan was the biggest thing in the world.
They're like rock stars, like a rock band is more, crazy personalities, unbelievable success highs. So, yeah, I agree. And so Pippen was, as you mentioned, Sap, on Dan Patrick talking about all this. And Dan Patrick, I think, is maybe the best interviewer in the business. He's really, this is what he's best at because he's been around forever. And so, he did push back on Pippen saying, you're calling him racist, to which Pippen said, yeah, I'm feel comfortable doing that. And then Dan Patrick also brought up the time that Michael Jordan passed the ball to Steve Kerr for the game-winning shot in the 98 finals and said, was that racist that, Steve Kerr hit a shot there? And Pippen said, well, that was all rehearsed, that Jordan rehearsed that moment talking about passing the ball, and that was staged for the media and it wasn't authentic. And so I don't know. He's all over the place here.
That's the craziest part, Jen.
Except that he's talking about this stuff, almost 30 years later, and that none of it has come out before, kind of lends to the theory that, all right, he's just making this shit up as he goes along now.
He got pissed. He got pissed after The Last Dance.
You're right. He did.
Was made to look weak. I think he was sympathetic when you found out what his background was, that, he grew up essentially living in extreme poverty. I mean, this poverty and then this extreme poverty, his floors in his house were literally dirt. I think his dad was in a wheelchair. His brother was in a wheelchair, a big family. It's like this guy came from absolutely nothing to make himself one of the greatest players of all time. But this was his pushback, is to write a book and to now go on a tour. And again, if you're not saying crazy shit, then we're not going to talk about it. Yeah, that part about that Jordan rehearsed all that. Like Michael Jordan in the middle of the finals is going to worry about what his cameras are recording to see if Steve Kerr can hit a shot. Like, is Michael Jordan that confident? Maybe he is, to say, you know what, let Kerr have this shot. If we lose this game, I'll pull it out some other time anyway. Like, I mean, that's just crazy stuff. I think right now, Scottie Pippen at times almost sounds like a crazy radio host, right? Right-wing radio host who's just throwing out all these crazy things. I don't know if he has a relationship at all with Michael Jordan. I bet he doesn't, because Michael Jordan is not a guy that gives people a second chance. Michael Jordan was very close to Charles Barkley. I don't even think they have a relationship.
No, they don't.
Because Barkley said something demeaning about Michael Jordan. You say anything bad about Jordan, he shuts you out and shuts you off.
This is pissing him off.
Why he's so great.
Sure this is pissing him off.
Yeah, this is irritating him to no end. So maybe we'll see another 10-part series on this. I mean, it's
but Pippen's going scorched earth. But scorched earth is one thing when you have a legitimate gripe and you're calling out things that actually happened. It's a different thing when you're seemingly making things up, which is what I fully believe in this story.
And you are never going to win against Michael Jordan in the court of public opinion. No one will win that. I mean, I put out on Twitter, and I'm a nobody, that I think LeBron James is a greater basketball player than Michael Jordan. The hate I get back is comical. I just, brush it off. But if you even bring that up, people absolutely flip out. He is the most beloved athlete in the history of this country. And I don't even know who's second. He's also one of the most respected athletes in the history of this country, and deservedly so. The guy was enormous. He was fantastic. He was worldwide. He's the biggest thing to happen to American sports probably since Babe Ruth, and I can't even compare it to that because Babe Ruth died, 70 years ago.
Do you think this is going to do long-term damage to Pippen's reputation, or is it worth it to him to do this to pump the book and the bourbon?
Does he need money? I mean, part of the Last Dance was that Pippen was grossly underpaid. I mean, at one point he was the 72nd highest paid player.
Yeah.
I'm sure he was bitter, and back then it was a little bit different. I mean, today Pippen would have got his ass out of there and got like a 4-year contract from some other team. I don't even know what he made in Houston and Portland. It probably wasn't a ton of money. I don't know if he invested his money wisely. Jordan was grossly underpaid, Jet. Up until Jordan's last 2 years in Chicago, he wasn't making huge money. He made huge money his last 2 years in Chicago, made big money in Washington, and then the Nike money has always been enormous for Michael Jordan and all the endorsements. Pippen didn't get those types of endorsements because it was Jordan's team. Pippen was the perfect Robin, right? I mean, like that whole expression came from Jordan and Pippen, Batman and Robin, the perfect Batman and the perfect Robin. And that's why they were so successful. Pippen wants to rewrite history. Is it going to hurt him? I mean, I know he was doing some stuff with ESPN on the jump, and I thought he was pretty good. He's got that deep voice, and I think he's a bright guy. But now people are going to say, do we really need this guy on here? He's a little unhinged, although maybe that sells. I mean, there are unhinged people on TV. We know that.
Yeah. So, I'm curious to see if he says any more crazy stuff as this book and bourbon label continue to be pushed and he does more of the car wash media tour.
Maybe we'll get him on, Jet. I'll try to reach out to get Scottie on. I like the hairdo, too. He's got it all done up. But I think people are forgetting how great a player this guy was because I think that the comps today are Kawhi Leonard and Paul George. Now, those guys score a little bit more because Pippen didn't necessarily have to until he played without Jordan, and he did average, I think, 23 points per game 1 year in the 90s, which is like averaging 26 or 27 now. But all the other things he did, he was a better rebounder than Jordan, a better passer, as good a defender. He just obviously didn't have the offensive arsenal that Jordan had. Certainly didn't have that killer instinct, that Mamba mentality. There I go again. I hate saying that, but you get my point. Sometimes you have to throw it in there. And again, that's more Kobe's coined the Mamba mentality, but Jordan's invented the Mamba mentality, I think.
Yeah, again, I'm interested to see. I feel like this probably isn't the end of wild stuff that he's going to say, especially as the book gets closer to being released. So we'll keep an eye on that. But that's going to do it for us today here, Sap, at the Pick and Roll NBA podcast with Jet and Sap. We are presented by Full Press Coverage. Check out their website, fullpresscoverage.com, for this and other great podcasts and articles. Make sure you check out our Twitters at JohnSap25, at Jet Stryer, for all the latest on the show and different polls and stuff that Sap likes to put out. And I will notify you about really exciting plays that happen in the middle of basketball games. If you want to know that. And our YouTube, if you're not watching already, is youtube.com/JetStryer. The podcast can be found wherever podcasts are in fact found. Sap, we will be back tomorrow reacting to the Bucks game, and we will be previewing Game 6 of the Clippers and Suns series, and we'll see what other crazy shit Scottie Pippen has to say. So I will talk to you tomorrow, Sep, and make sure that you like and subscribe to our podcast, and we'll talk to you then, everybody. See ya.